Motivated by love. Though we have an obligation to be generous, our primary motivation for giving should be our love for God and for one another. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
Paul captured the essence of this principle after he referred to the Macedonian churches as a model. And notice Paul's encouragement as he goes on in this letter dealing with generosity. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6 and 7. So we urged Titus. Now I want to just pause for a moment. That word in urged is very significant because it represents a Greek word that means encouragement. We encouraged Titus. We urged Titus. Keep that thought in mind because it's going to come up in a moment, another text. So he urged Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also complete among you this act of grace. In other words, when Titus was there, he talked to the Corinthians about this and what they had committed to and were not following through in terms of these offerings, particularly for those who were in need in the Jerusalem, Judea area. And then he says, I think perhaps exaggerating, who am I to say that about Paul? But if you understand the Corinthians, he's trying to be positive when he says, now as you excel in everything, in faith, speech, knowledge, and all diligence, and in your love for us, excel also in this act of grace. What is the act of grace? The act of grace is generosity. So he's saying, I want you to grow and mature in this area of generosity. And when he says this, he wants to make it clear that in urging them, he's not commanding them. And that's fascinating. Notice what he says. I'm not saying this as a command. Rather, by means of the diligence of others, I am testing the genuineness of your love. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And by the way, the word rich there refers to being rich in grace. And he's used the illustration of the Macedonians who gave out of poverty. That's being rich in grace. They weren't giving out of plenty. They were giving out of poverty, some of them, and that took grace. And so he's saying, I want you to become rich in grace. That can be really misinterpreted if we don't understand the context. Paul makes an appeal. I said to remember the word urge, right? Well, if you go back to Romans 12, 1 and 2, generally speaking, Paul is saying, therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to what? To be generous? No, he's being more general here. He said, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Paul is saying, I'm not commanding you. I am encouraging you. And the basis of my encouragement is what God has done for you. Therefore, I urge you, by God's mercies and his salvation and his grace, to be rich in grace in your life. And then he says, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Now, again, you see, if you look at that text in Romans, he is saying, in essence, God does not want you to love him because you're obligated. God wants our love and our commitment because of our love for him and what he's done for us. And that's a powerful principle. And it correlates with what the Apostle Paul is saying to the Corinthians about giving, because giving is part and parcel of Romans 12, 1 and 2. It's a part of our lives. And so when we present material things, the same principle applies. God does not want us to give because of a command, but because of our appreciation for his grace. And that's why Paul said, this is not a command. I'm pleading with you. I'm urging you. Isn't this reasonable? Shouldn't you worship him because of everything he's done for you? Now, that leads to a very interesting, what could be considered almost a contradiction. But when you see the whole, it's not. And I've called this indebtedness and obligation. And Paul wrote this letter to the Romans after he had gone down to Corinth and left Corinth and was finishing up the third journey. And he said this to the Romans, right now I'm traveling to Jerusalem to serve the saints. You see, he's on that trip. He's finishing up the third journey and he's going to head for Jerusalem. Because Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. In other words, Paul has been in Macedonia and he referred to their giving and their generous giving in spite of their poverty. And he now has been to Corinth. He wrote this letter after Titus had gone to Corinth, after he had gone to Corinth. And it says the Corinthians, who were part of Achaia, had responded. So he's writing to the Romans to say, because Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. The Corinthians had followed through. Yes, they were pleased and indeed are indebted to them. That is, whom? The saints in Jerusalem. Why? For if the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual benefits, which they have, we have, that is, the Jewish benefits, he came first to the Jew, and then to the Greek, to the Gentile. For if the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual benefits, then they are obligated to minister to them in material needs. So here Paul gets very specific and says, we're obligated. Now that appears to be, in some respects, contradictory, but it's a very delicate balance. And it's true of everything we do in the Christian life. God does not want us to present our bodies to him, a living sacrifice, because we feel I'm obligated. Okay, God, this is what I have to do. Here I am, which, by the way, is contradictory because that's not a true spirit. The same is true with material possessions. Paul is saying God doesn't want us to be obligated in our sense of motivation, even though we are. He wants us to give out of hearts of love and appreciation and thankfulness. And that's a delicate balance, and it applies to everything in life. If you're married, you don't want your spouse to care for you and love you because they're obligated. The fact is, I am obligated because I'm to love my wife as Christ loved me. But it's not very rewarding for someone to say, well, I'm going to love you because I have an obligation. That's reciprocal, isn't it? Works both ways. See, that's true in many aspects of life. It's a very delicate balance. And that, of course, relates to, as Paul says here, our generosity or our giving. I love this passage in Philippians. And Paul, by the way, wrote this letter after he had gotten to Jerusalem, after he had delivered the gifts, and then ultimately he was imprisoned in Rome at the book of Acts, his first imprisonment. But he was in need, and the Philippians helped him materially. And he wrote and he thanked them. So he says this to the Philippians, for even in Thessalonica you sent gifts for my need several times. In other words, what he's saying is, on my second journey, we started the church in Philippi. We had to leave under persecution. We went down to Thessalonica. We started the church. We didn't have any way to put bread on our table. In fact, we worked night and day just to make sure we could buy food because we didn't want to be obligated. But you Philippians, you sent gifts to help us, even on that second journey. So he says, even in Thessalonica, you sent gifts for my need several times. Not that I seek the gift, But I seek the profit that is increasing to your account. Wow, what a motivation. This, by the way, is an accounting term. And what he's simply saying is what you did for me is gaining interest right now in heaven. That's the metaphor. Increasing to your account in glory. But I've received everything in full and have an abundance. I'm fully supplied. He's writing from prison now. Having received from Epaphroditus what you provided. Epaphroditus may have been the senior pastor leader there. And then notice he says, what you did is a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. And notice those words. They're very similar to Romans 12, 1 and 2. The good and perfect and what? Pleasing way to serve God. Pleasing. An acceptable, he uses the word, sacrifice. We're to present our bodies a living sacrifice. And what you have done in caring for me physically is also an acceptable sacrifice. See, you can't separate that aspect of our life from Romans 12, 1 and 2 and how we live in relationship to God. It's all a part of what it means to be a dedicated Christian. Which leads to an interesting question, and it's this. How does an understanding of God's grace enable us to give freely and cheerfully even though we have an obligation? How do you balance that? Well, think of your other relationships. Think of your marriage. Think of your children. How are you going to apply that? We have an obligation to be godly people, but how do we do it out of heart of love and grace and joy? Titus, when Paul wrote to Titus, and Titus, of course, this is years later, in terms of Titus, who with Paul started churches on the island of Crete. And Paul left Titus in Crete to establish the churches, to appoint elders and leaders. And in chapter 2, he said something that is really powerful that helps answer this question. How do we maintain that balance? That basic motivation of love. And I call this motivated by grace because this is what Paul is saying. For the grace of God has appeared. What is that grace? Well, Paul answers it. Bringing salvation for all people. When we were lost, God sent his Son. He died for us. So we could be saved by grace, an act of grace on God's part. And what does this mean? What should it do for us who are believers? Instructing us. Another translation, disciplining us, instructing us. What instructs us? God's grace. God's grace teaches us to deny godlessness and worldly lusts. Why should we live godly lives? Because of God's grace. Not the fact that God's demanding our commitment to him. But he wants our love because of his grace. And his grace should instruct us to live in a sensible, righteous, and godly way in the present age. Now, Paul is talking here about Romans 12, 1 and 2. But inherent in Romans 12, 1 and 2, in the presentation of our bodies as a living sacrifice, also we find material things that are a part of our life. And it should be the grace of God that teaches us to give generously out of what God has given to us. So let me repeat the principle. Though we have an obligation to be generous, our primary motivation for giving should be our love for God and for one another.